Okay, a theme is a complete musical idea that also serves as the primary musical idea for your piece of music. Now, a theme is just a motif that develops, and a motif is a fragmentary idea. It's the smallest musical unit you can get aside from just like notes and chords and intervals. So these motifs develop into phrases, and the best explanation I can come up for with a phrase comes from this guy called Arnold Schoenberg, who wrote the book on the subject, and he said, "The term phrase means, structurally, a unit approximating to what one could sing in a single breath." So in short, the motif develops into a phrase, the phrases come together to form a thing, bada bing, bada boom, hey look at you, you're writing music. Okay, so let's explore this in depth. Let's just dive right in. Alright, we can break this theme into 4 parts. The first section is the introduction to our basic motif. Then we have an answer to our motif. All right, then we get the motif again. And then we get another answer, which concludes the whole musical idea. When we step back and look at the whole structure, you can see that it really cleanly splits into 2 halves, the first 2 sections and the last 2 sections. Each of these 2 halves of our theme make up a phrase. They have a clear beginning and a clear ending. You can see how they're related because they both start with the same motif. In fact, these 2 phrases are so similar, they only really change at the ending. But that ending is really important because that's what leads the first phrase into the second phrase. If you look at the cadence or the ending to these phrases, you can hear that the ending to the first phrase isn't as strong as the second. You can kind of think of it like the first phrase ends with a comma and the second phrase ends with a period. So we'd say that the first phrase has a weaker cadence than the second phrase, making the end of the second phrase feel more like our final ending and giving our theme a sense of completion. So when you have 2 phrases that begin with the same motif and the first phrase has a weaker cadence than the second phrase, we call this structure a period. And in a period, these phrases have special names. The first one is the antecedent phrase and the second one is the consequent phrase. The consequent phrase answers the antecedent phrase and together they form a period, which is a type of theme or subject or melody or whatever you want to call it. A period is an example of a complete musical idea. But there's a way to build on that. Let's look at one of my favorite main themes to a film ever. Okay, let's break it down section by section, just like what we did with Lord of the Rings. Okay, so that was the introduction to our motif. If this is a period, we'd expect some kind of answer. So let's see what we get. All right, in the second section, the motif just repeated. Now, we can't really call this the antecedent phrase of a period because in an antecedent phrase, you see some kind of answer to your motif, not just a repetition. So let's see what we get in the third section. Now, in a period, we'd expect to see a carbon copy of the first motif, but that's not what we got. You can see how it's related to our first motif. This dotted rhythm followed by a triplet keeps going, and it gets a little crazy. So let's move on to the fourth section and see if we get any answers. Well, that's a cadential idea, so the whole thing comes to a close more or less, but this is clearly not a period. This first section is the introduction to our motif. It's the basic idea. This second section repeats the motif. Unlike the period, the second section isn't really answering anything, it's just a restatement. Now in this third section, we can see pieces of the motif, but it's changed. The motif is broken apart and developed. Some people call this the fragmentation, others call this the liquidation. I think it depends on who you're talking to. Technically, they mean different things, but what's important to get at is that this third section is starting to break apart and develop the motif before moving on to the fourth and final section, which is our cadential idea that concludes our complete musical statement. This structure is called a sentence, but instead of calling these the antecedent and consequent phrases like we do with a period, these become the presentation phrase and the continuation phrase. Now, although these ideas of putting together a complete theme have existed for hundreds of years, identifying the structure of a theme as a sentence or a period really comes down to that Arnold Schoenberg guy and his book, Fundamentals of Music Composition, which may or may not be where this video is coming from. Like, he talks about liquidating the motif in the first part of the continuation phrase, but his description of liquidation really mimics a technique called fragmentation where you break apart a motif to explore its pieces. And then when it came to periods and sentences, Schoenberg said, "The sentence is a higher form of construction than the period, since development is the driving force of musical construction. To begin it at once indicates forethought." So he's playing favorites. He likes sentences more than periods. But he's got a point. The sentence gives you more room to develop and alter your motif than the period. So if you want to boil it down, you can break both a sentence and a period into 4 sections each. The period has a motif, then an answer, the motif again, and then a cadential idea. The sentence has a motif, the motif again, then it gets fragmented or liquidated, whatever you want to call it, and then again finishes with the cadential idea. So if you want to oversimplify this whole process process as much as possible, you can argue that the only real difference between a period and a sentence is what happens in the second phrase, which is exactly what Schoenberg says. Now, I want to clarify, you can make this whole subject way more complicated. Like, technically, there are some harmonic elements that go into these structures, especially when it comes to historical instances when you look at the cadential formula, but this is already kind of dense as it is, and I don't want to make it more complicated than I have to. The idea of constructing themes really comes down to how and why you develop the motif the way you do. And there are ways to get around these rules, like these themes don't all have to necessarily follow an exact cookie-cutter recipe in order to still be called a period or a sentence. So this is an interesting one. That was the first section, the introduction to our main motif. Okay, now we have a repetition with some slight embellishment. It's not uncommon to see some slight alteration of the motif in a sentence as a means of anticipating a more complex development in the fragmentation. So right off the bat, we see something that looks like the presentation phrase in a sentence. Okay, this part's a little unusual, but not game-breaking. We see the beginning of the motif begin, but it quickly breaks up and develops. So all in all, this is just a fragmentation. All right, and then it comes to conclusion with our cadential formula in that fourth section. So pretty standard sentence, but compare that to another one of Williams's works. Okay, so right here I'm going to call this one motif. Some people argue that it's two, but for the time being, we're just going to call this section one motif. All right, this section looks like our basic idea with some slight embellishment, just like what we saw with binary sunset. So we might be expecting some kind of sentence structure, which means that our third section should be our fragmentation. But that is the same music we heard in the first section, which makes this look more like a period. Then we finish with a cadential idea. So what's going on? Well, Schoenberg says the critical difference between a period and a sentence is the second phrase, and since the second phrase begins with an exact copy of what happens in the opening of the first phrase, then this is technically a period. This is the antecedent phrase, which makes this the consequent phrase. But that means that the answer to the basic idea in the antecedent phrase, right here, uses a lot of the same material from the basic idea itself. If you look at this idea as not one motif but two, you can see that this first motif just repeats. So what it looks like is happening is that Williams is preserving and repeating the first part of the primary motif as a means of making it easier for his audience to grasp onto what will be the main motif for Superman, at the cost of fully developing his motific idea. In other words, repeating this idea over and over again without changing it might make this whole system a little more simple than what you might see in other periods and sentences, but it'll make it easier for a broader audience to figure out and follow along with the main idea. But what's more interesting is that this is the exact same structure Silvestri used in his theme for the Avengers. He states the main motif, then in the second section he preserves the first part of the motif while altering the second half. Then he copies the main motif again, so this is technically a period. And then he has his cadential idea. But these aren't the only places where you see a composer not completely developing a motif in their theme. Regardless of whether they're periods or sentences, I actually found a handful of themes that follow this same system of not developing the first half of their motif in order to make the primary idea for their theme more pronounced and arguably easier to remember. These are just some examples I was able to find, but I'm sure there are more out there. But if you want to take this idea to the next level, you can look at what newer film composers from the last 20 or so years have been doing, and that they aren't really developing their motifs into themes at all. They just play smaller motivic figures that serve to create some kind of texture or suggest an idea. But they never actually develop anything into a complete statement. They just play smaller motivic figures that serve to create some sort of texture or suggest an idea, but they never actually develop anything into a complete statement. Now, like I said, this can contribute to an overall texture for your film, and maybe even help set a tone if you want to have something that's less pronounced. But that might come at the cost of maybe making your soundtrack sound less noticeable or even less memorable. So there you have it. That's what goes into a theme. Now, periods and sentences aren't the only way to develop motifs into complete themes, but they are the textbook standard when it comes to putting a theme together. So if you want to break these rules, just remember that the whole idea is to establish a motif and then develop it into a complete musical idea. Now, although I couldn't find any examples of that in a film score that wasn't just a period or a sentence, I'm sure that they exist, and we'll both find a lot of examples of motifs developing into a complete theme that isn't a period or a sentence in the comments section below. No matter how hard you try, you can never beat the hive mind that is the internet. Or, in the end of the day, if you don't want to, you could just not develop your motif, and you can use your musical material to help develop some sort of texture. I don't know, I'm not your boss. You could do whatever you want. My only question is that if you don't develop a motif, does that still technically count as a theme? Hopefully this video answered a few questions about themes, and for some people out there, it might help explain how and why you can remember the main theme to a film from 40 years ago, but not the one you saw last week. So the next time you find yourself humming your favorite theme, take a minute and figure out how it's constructed. You might be surprised with what you find. Thanks for watching. I'd like to thank my patrons for making these videos possible, with a very special thank you to Anna Birch, AFN Matt, Megan Hernshire, Ethan Rooney, Hayden Elza, and Donovan Hodges. If you like what you saw here, be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. Follow me on Twitter and Twitch to have your musical questions answered live. And if you really like what I'm doing, consider supporting the channel on Patreon. That's going to be it for me for now. Thanks for watching.